In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Bungubox Soleil. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I expected an absolute failure here. And it can be, but it can be saved with the right pen. I'm gonna say that what we see on camera is a bit darker than what can be seen on just from my eye. Now that's in its lighter tones. In its darker tones, you can read it quite a bit easier, but you have to really set up for that situation. So just keep in mind what you're seeing on camera is easier than in person. Now, it does shade when it's shading, and it does it from yellow to orange, and it looks really good when it does it. A full page of this is an absolute assault on your eyes, though, and it's headache-inducing. And you're going to notice I'm going to keep the comments a bit shorter here because I'm reading what I've written, and it's difficult, and I wrote it. This I don't know about using very much. I'm happy I tried it, just to have tried it, but I see when a yellow looks like this and think this is one of the reasons people bash yellow inks for not having much use, because it's made to not be very useful here. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Moleskine Singularity with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some shading. It's much more orange and much more readable on camera than it is in person. In person, it's quite difficult to read, to be completely honest. I can see the darker areas, like the word suddenly is pretty easy. And then the top line, the, is very easy, but at, right next to it, is a bit harder to read, just being that much lighter. So it's there, technically. The medium nib is about the same tone as the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it does shade, it shades fairly nicely. It's just hard to read, so I guess if you wanted to punish your enemies, then you should write all of your secrets in this ink so that they would have to read it, because my God. The broad nib is significantly darker than the medium, with no feather, no spread. It does shade quite well, and it is able to be read without wanting to tear your own eyes out. It's much darker, but you get a lot more of the orange than you do yellow. I like yellow inks when they work well. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, shocker, and no show-through, no ghosting, shocker. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Mini with a fine nib, a Pilot Vanishing Point with a medium nib, a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get a little bit of shading that's showing up on camera. Again, I'm going to point out it is much more orange than it is in person. It's a lot more yellow in person, a lot more difficult to read. I'm actually looking at it in the camera because in person, my eyes are hurting just reading through this second sample. The medium is about the same tone as the fine. No feather, no spread. Yes, we see its shading. I don't know, because I have to look at it in a camera. I'm really not enjoying this. It's a weird way to read from my notebook. The broad nib is much darker than the fine or the medium. It has no feather, it has no spread. Yes, it does shade. Yes, I can actually look at the writing on the page and read it from there, which means regardless, it's doing much better than the fine or the medium did. Looking at the back of the page, we get very little ghosting, surprise, and no bleed through. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. Yes, we get shading. No, I'm not looking at it on the page. I have to look at it in the camera because when I look at it on the page, it is very difficult to read. The medium is a little bit lighter than the fine. Hard to believe, but it is. It has no feather. It has no spread. It does have shading. I'm not looking at the page. I'm looking at the camera because the page is largely unreadable to the naked eye. The broad nib is darker than the medium, only a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread. It is just dark enough to actually be able to read with the eye instead of the camera. If you carry a camcorder with you, then this is a perfect ink because you're really going to be able to read it without any kind of a problem then. Looking at the back of the page, a huge surprise is there's no ghosting on this incredibly hard to see ink. And there is no bleeding, so there you go. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is even lighter than it was on the other papers. It's much easier to read on camera, as I've said before, and I have to keep stressing that because it's not very often I say I hate an ink, but I think I hate this because of the pain it is causing my eyes. The feather, or the fine has no feather, no spread. It does shade technically, looking at it in the camera, not looking at it in person, because my eyes are now bleeding. The medium nib is a little bit lighter than the fine. I don't know how, but it's practically not there in person. It has no feather. It has no spread. It does have shading. I say all of that looking at the camera. In person, looking at the page, it's perfect. There could be nothing that could be wrong with it because you can't see it. The broad nib is quite a bit darker than the medium or the fine, but it is not really dark enough to comfortably use. So we're going to use the camera, where it has no feather and no spread, and it does have shading. The only problem is using it in the real world. Looking at the back of the page, there's practically no ghosting in this ink I can't see. And, of course, no bleeding. But if it did, I'm sure I couldn't see it. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 3. Here is Diatramentis Mahatma Gandhi Saffron. Here is Krishna Freedom Gold. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get, I'm going to say there's no feather and no spread and some shading, but to be completely honest, it's hard to see. I'm looking at a tiny little monitor right here. I think I see a little bit of shading. I can't read it in person. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's horrible. I've said it 3 times. It's that horrible. The medium is darker than the fine. It has no feather, has no spread, has some shade, all supposedly, because I'm looking at the camera, not the paper. I can't read this on the paper. I know nobody's listening at this point because you've all tuned out because you're smarter than me. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, no shade. It's horrible because I have to see it on camera to see it at all. Looking at the back of the page, we get almost no ghosting and we get no bleed through. Surprise? I can't see the ink, so I'm not surprised. I hate this ink. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Pacifique. Here is a green ink by Diatramentis there, Jane Austen or dark green. Here is a red ink by Montegrappa there, red. Here is a purple ink by Robert Oster there, Purple Soul, formerly known as Purple Jazz. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, I first want to say, Bungubox, I really feel like you don't like people when you made this color, unless you made it for someone specific on request and somehow accidentally a bottle made it to America, because this is bad. The fine has no feather, no spread, no shade. You know why I can say there's no feather and no spread? Because I can't really see it in person. It's horrible. I can see it some. It's horrible. So yes, there's feather, there's spread. No, there's no shading. The medium nib is a little darker than the fine. It does feather, it does spread. I can see that when I get close to look at it. It's hard to see on camera. It's hard to see in person. It's hard to see. I'm so sorry that anybody that's actually listening to this, it's horrible. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. I'm actually assuming that there is a little bit of feather, and I'm assuming that there is a little bit of spread. I'm going to try and zoom this in post to be able to see it a little bit better, but this is bad. Looking at the back of the page, I can't see any spots where the ink came through, which is convenient because it's hard to see the ink in general. I've beat that dead horse back to life and back to death again. Looking at the back of the page, there's also very minimal ghosting. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? So what do you say about choosing a pen for an ink that is this difficult to see? Only a very gusher of a wet pen, preferably broad, very wet, or it's an assault on the eyes. I'm going to let you just watch this writing for a little bit because I can't even fill in some of what's so yuck about this ink. Thanks for watching.